Hello, good afternoon. My name is Amy Scott. I am the Executive Vice President of Research and Interpretation and the Marilyn B. and Calvin B. Gross Curator of Visual Arts at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I would like to say thank you to all of the 2021 Masters of the American West sponsors, and I am honored, along with the Autry trustees and staff, to welcome you to another Autry Artist Salon. Today, my guest is the renowned Pueblo potter, distinguished sculptor, and masters participant, Tammy Garcia. Tammy is from a long and distinguished line of artists, and her work fuses classic forms and designs with traditional Pueblo pottery and her own innovative sense of style, integrating sources as wide as Art Deco, the German Bauhaus school, and other modernist movements to create forms and geometries that connect hundreds of years of tradition while situating a now ancient art form squarely within the present. Whether in ceramic, bronze, or glass, Garcia's sculpture often features raised designs that pop off the vessel's surface, a technique that she has helped pioneer and that we will learn more about shortly. Tammy is recognized as a leader in the drive to showcase tradition and legacy while innovating on the same. She's, of course, well known to museums and major collections across the country. She was awarded first place in bronze at the 2019 SWAIA Santa Fe Indian Market, first place in sculpture at the 2018 Heard Museum Guild Indian Fair and Market, and in both 2016 and 2012, she won the James R. Parks Trustees Purchase Award at the Masters of the American West, both of those sculptures, along with two others now being in the Autry Museum's collection. If you have any further questions during our conversation, please just enter them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your window, and we will leave some time at the end to get to those for sure. The Autry, of course, represents something unique, I think, to each of us. It certainly does to me, and I know it does to all of you on this call. For me, it's the idea of the museum as a place where artists from around the country produce diverse works that represent the creative traditions, but also the contemporary diversity of the Western experience. So Tammy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Sure thing. Rob, if we can go to the first slide, please. So I thought we would begin by talking just a little bit about your artistic DNA, which is legendary, and what it was like to grow up in part of an art-making family where art was really just interwoven as part of your everyday life. And here you are, of course, with your mother and your sister, Autumn, who is also a master's participant. So what was that like as a child? And being around artistic production all the time, did it intrigue you? Did at some point, did you want to rebel against it? What was that experience like?
You know, when I think back to my life when I was a young girl, I remember being happy. And it was an exciting time. I have very fond memories of living in Santa Clara, Pueblo, and the Santa Clara, Pueblo, everybody knew everybody. And if they didn't know me personally, they knew my mother or they knew my grandmother. And, you know, not only were there many friends, but also family members. Serafina, my great grandmother had, you know, a number of children, and, you know, we come from a pretty extended family, and I grew up knowing my great aunts, my second cousins, you know, all the older women we all referred to as aunties. Mm-hmm. And since, you know, a young age, I remember what I looked forward to on the weekends was riding my bicycle. And my sister Autumn and I, we would we would go visit family members, and we didn't have cell phones. And so we would just show up at our great grandma Christina's. We would start with Grandma Mary and make our way down. We had a route, and ultimately it led to the candy store. From the candy store, we would go visit Aunt Grace, Medicine Flower, Teresita Naranjo, who was my grandma's sister, was Grace's neighbor, so we knew everybody. And my sister and I, we were pretty outgoing and felt, obviously safe. My mom felt safe to let us go as, 7 years old, 8 years old, 9, these are early memories from, and they were good times, definitely. And, visiting, I can remember going to see Christina, and you would smell the odor of her firing black pottery. And the smell was recognizable because we would get involved. Our mother involved us, our grandmother involved us. On days they fired, we were asked to come and help, and we were put to work.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. Would your mother, your grandmother, your aunties send you out to gather clay? Did they make you into their little assistants? I mean, was it kind of assumed in such a family that you would become an artist? And if so, it just really must have been ingrained. It sounds like it was a very sort of sensory experience in terms of the smell of the heat. Certainly, wet clay has a really distinctive feeling in one's hands. I mean, it just sounds like this kind of immersive environment that's really all about art and clay. And if you could just talk maybe just a little bit louder, that would be great.
So yes, education started early, since infancy. And I would say infancy because having 3 children of my own, and my first, when she was crawling, I worked at home. And so I was able to be there, and take care of my children when they were very young. And when they started crawling, I had to vacuum on a regular basis because she got a taste for the clay early. So yeah, education begins at a young age. Like I said, we were asked to help, and we were given jobs that we could do, as children, and even as teenagers, when I was a little stronger. To fire pottery, it's really a group effort. It takes several people to help in this process, and I was given the job of the cleanup crew. So one of my sister and one of our jobs was to remove the burnt manure that wasn't usable, and we got to use a wheelbarrow to remove this unusable manure. And it wasn't a job, it was fun. The fun part was giving each other rides back in the wheelbarrow and going as fast as we can, pushing each other. Work was fun. And I think because we were together as a family, and of course, Grandma always had good treats. So it's
found ways to make it worth your while.
Yeah. And I think because, my mother grandmother, great grandmother, you know, these were self-employed women. They worked at home, and, you know, they were able to keep an eye on their children. And, you know, not only did we learn by observing, but by participating. And yeah, when they gathered clay, that was a big ordeal. You know, we had to go into the foothills and dig the clay out using picks and shovels. And, you know, it was very physical, very labor. Grandma didn't let us get the easy, loose clay that had fallen. We had to dig for the pure clay, and that took more effort.
Yeah.
So, you know, that we definitely, I learned quality. I remember showing her a bucket of the clay I gathered, and she said, "That's no good." And I had to pour it out. And, you know, she had an eye for quality. And I think that's what's pretty cool about, you know, this pottery. It's been handed down, you know, generation after generation. And the history, the pottery history for the Pueblo people in New Mexico, you know, it goes back. It was so fun. If you Google Fred Harvey at Santa Clara Pueblo, you'll see a picture of my grandma Christina and Mary, Grandma Mary as a young girl. So, you know, they grew up in an era where they knew Fred Harvey. You know, they sold their work at the La Fonda gift shop in Santa Fe. So I think, you know, not only was, I think as a teenager, living that close to Santa Fe, the fact that Santa Fe was only 20 minutes away, you know, this incredible art destination where not only did we get to see family work being sold, you know, in galleries around the plaza, museums, you know, I could go to the museums in Santa Fe and see great grandma Serafina's work.
Yeah.
You know, it's definitely an inspiration.
And you have had a fairly major role, I think, in that marketplace and amongst a whole generation of artists now who really look to your kind of signature blend of traditional materials, traditional design, but also you have a great flair for innovation. So Rob, if you want to go to the next slide, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Blackware. And this is such a beautiful piece. I have always been sort of in love with Blackware, if for no other reason because of its minimalist appearance. But I find that the more that you look at these, historic or contemporary, the more sort of shades and depth and dimensions of color, even though they are technically monochromatic, come out. So how is this achieved? How is this rich, deep, and gorgeous black achieved? Because I understand that it's also a very traditional method and fairly unique to Santa Clara.
Yeah, the firing process it's probably the most nerve-wracking. It's the most difficult part. You know, of the process. It's the final stage. And it's to achieve this black color, it's fired outside. So you have the natural elements like wind, rain, snow, you know, the moisture that's in the air.
What do you mean by fired outside? Is that like an open pit? What does that look like?
Yes, it's fired outside, and we use wood as fuel. We use dry cedar wood and pine wood to ignite and heat the fire. It's an oxygen reduction that causes the piece to turn black. So when the piece gets a certain color, like a bright red, it's almost glowing. Another part is you go by instinct, you know, and sometimes it's hard to see the vase within the flames when the fire, you know, gets going. And the flames can, sometimes get in the way. And so you kind of go, well, it feels like it's been in there long enough. Let's cover it. And we cover it using dry horse manure. And that causes the oxygen to run out and you get a black finish. Before this process, there was the polychrome, which, you could see the colors of the clay, the red tones, the oxides were visible, but by smothering, we get this all black look. And Santa Clara black pottery has been documented since the 1700s. So it's, I had the opportunity to speak with Charles King today. You showed that image of Autumn, my mother Linda and I, that black and white. That was taken from a vintage slide camera by Will Wilson.
Yeah, I was going to ask. It's a beautiful image.
Thank you. Thanks. And it's really interesting how this is that image, the fact that that type of camera was used in the early 1900s. Charles had, his thought for this book was to incorporate the old, with the contemporary, with the living artists of today. And so we got to be photographed by this camera. One of the, in some way, it kind of resembles that black pottery, this mirror finish that's achieved. I guess, depending on who you ask, the fact that, the dry manure was used to achieve this black color. My grandma was firing black, her mother was, and I think this is so cool about the tradition of Pueblo pottery is how we learn from, from our mothers and our grandmothers teach us this method. And I think what's so cool is that we have choices. We have another color option in going with black. And, when we'll get into talking about bronze work. And I got into bronze after probably 13 years of working with clay professionally. And it was so exciting to be working with a medium that had the durability of metal, the strength. Unlike clay, which is so fragile. Working in bronze, I also had the option of different colors, patinas. So now I had more color options.
So if we could, Rob, if we can actually go to the 5th slide, I think, which is another ceramic piece. And then I want to get into the bronze work as well. But this, since we're talking about form and design, and one of the things that has always struck me about your work is it looks so perfect. I mean, it's just, the angles are precise. The design is complete. It's all around. It's symmetrical. But it's by no means repetitive. So this is an enormous piece. It was, I think it's one of your biggest, and it was a commission from Mrs. Autry. It's in the museum lobby. As we speak, it's absolutely gorgeous. So can you tell us a little bit about how, first of all, how it is that you go about creating such symmetry and such, perfection in terms of form, as well as design over such a large surface with this process, the coiling process, the wet clay, and of course the firing that is, it involves a great deal of intuition and sort of, knowledge about how the heat and the chemicals work together. But also there's a lot of room for error and malfunction and things to go wrong and things to blow up. And I mean, it's such a, it's a difficult process, and you managed to achieve such precision out of it. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about sort of the process, especially relative to these large vessels. And of course, you're known for sort of pushing the dimensions literally of what it's possible to do in this medium.
My grandma was a perfectionist. And, you know, when I was 16 years old, that's really when I started making pottery, starting and completing a piece. You know, I don't consider what I did as a child, I don't know, working with clay, you know, and I never really finished anything as a child. Just, you know, it wasn't until I was 16 when I made my first pieces and began selling them immediately. My grandma had her home was like a gallery. You know, she had her home open to tourists who would visit Santa Clara Pueblo, and that, you know, they could come into her home and see her work. You know, and I would say the first 10 years of working with clay was all about symmetry. That's all I focused on. I can remember making nothing but water jars for several years and just perfecting the form, learning where to place the coil to achieve the shape you want.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. The clay we use, we mine ourselves from the hills. And we also mine volcanic ash from the nearby hills. And the ashes are temper. And that mix alone, that process, you have to have it just right. You know, I can remember helping my mother and grandmother mix clay in her garage in the winter time and my feet being cold.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and thinking, we got to plan this a little better. Let's mix clay in the summer. But that ratio of volcanic and ash has to be just right. You know, if you don't have enough ash, your clay will not be strong enough and you won't be able to make large vessels like this.
Mm-hmm.
If you have too much ash, it makes it difficult to carve, to polish. Yes, everything is so finicky. And I think you know, when it comes time to firing, everything has to be in order. You know, everything has to be in place.
Mm-hmm.
You got to have, you know, if it's going to be black, you want to make sure you have enough manure. You know, you want to fire when the weather is nice.
Mm-hmm.
I wait until you know, come springtime to fire black pottery. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
don't want to do it in the winter. You have moisture, you know, that can affect your heat. Yeah, it's pretty finicky. My mother was recalling a time when her mom was saying, you know, you don't want to make pottery, it's difficult. And with Valentine's around the corner, I started coming up with all these heartbreaking jokes with clay. You know, clay will break your heart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can spend a lot of time building something and have it not survive in the fire.
Right. Right.
And so you really gotta be able to take these make this an opportunity to learn. You know, I can remember firing, you know, in a group with my mom and grandma, my uncles, and if a piece would break, we would all stand around and discuss, maybe you don't have enough ash in your clay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, try to resolve the issue. And you know, there were times in my early working with clay in the early days where I thought, I do not want to make clay for a living. I want a steady paycheck. You know, I want a guaranteed paycheck. You know, if I spend a month or two on something, and it took getting a job as a dishwasher. After 1 week, I knew clay wasn't so bad. I wanted to give it another try. um, and
Well,
you
talk
know,
to us just a little bit, I'm sorry, if you can, about the design of this piece. Does it, when it goes into the fire, is this design already fully drawn? Is it, I mean, it's a reductive process because it appears to be carved in relief. At what point in the process does that happen? Do you draw these out on paper and then kind of trace it onto the pot? Because they're so keeping this kind of order and rhythm going out throughout a curved surface that's fairly sizable in a work such like this, so that it's really a beautiful, scene, no matter how you turn the vessel. How does that work? Because some of your designs are incredibly complex, yet they have this uniformity that kind of unfolds around the entire piece.
I think this piece that Miss Autry got, I think this was one of my last major vessels. And when it was being coiled and still wet, it was over 25 inches. It was, I couldn't, there was like a 10-inch gap. I couldn't wrap my arms around
Wow.
it. We forget about how big it was before it dried, so it was even bigger than what you see as the finish. It was even bigger than this. It was so big I couldn't lift it. I designed it and I carved it where I built it.
Mm-hmm.
When you're working on something of this scale, you have when it's to control the dampness, I keep it wrapped in plastic. And so while I'm working on it, it gets uncovered. And as it's drying, that's when I have a limited amount of time to get the design on there and get it carved.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working on a piece now, and the amount of detail involved, and this piece is maybe 7 inches in height, but it's got so much detail that I was fighting with it drying out on me before the design was done. Mm-hmm. And there's only so much you can do while it's damp. If you add moisture to it, you risk it cracking. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and as it's shrinking, yeah, there's so much that can go wrong. It's so nice. It's such an incredible relief when a piece is fired, mm-hmm. And it feels perfect to me.
When you take it out of the kiln in one piece, I can imagine that's got to be a huge sigh of relief, especially when you spend so long working on something. So for a piece like this, or any of your really complicated designs, do you draw them out? Do you just sort of draw as you go, as you carve in the piece itself? Like, how do you come up with these patterns that integrate organic forms, human figures, animals, stories? Does it happen as you're making the piece itself?
Working with clay, because there is that limit of time, I used to just draw directly on the pot using a pencil. And if I wasn't happy with the image, I would wipe it away and start over. But I noticed when I started working in larger vessels, I had to have my design figured out before I started putting it on clay. Mm-hmm. Because mm-hmm. the limit of time that I had, while, the drier it gets, it's harder on the hands. And so, to carve, because these are hand carved, the more drier it gets, the harder it is. So the ideal time to carve it, is at a certain a certain point. When I started going into larger vessels and knowing that I needed to have my designs figured out, I started drawing everything on paper, and you graph paper and pencil. Mm-hmm. And then I would transfer the design onto wax paper. And this is my secret. Wax paper makes an incredible stencil, and I could wrap it, I could form it and bend it and crease it to the form of the pot. So it didn't, so what I had drawn on a flat surface, I could now conform to the shape of the vessel. So wax paper, turned out to be give that I now had the luxury of time to design on paper and get the perfect design. Mm-hmm. And when I went to put it on clay, I knew exactly what I wanted, where, and then begin the carving process once the design was done.
A lot of people don't necessarily think of ceramics as a storytelling medium, but you have really started to change that. So can you maybe tell us a little bit about the story of this piece?
This piece, we have a hunter on it. Mm-hmm. There's deer. There's also deer dancers and a Pueblo in the background. This was a large canvas for me. There's really a lot going on in this design. One thing that I'm, definitely inspired by was growing up in the Pueblo. I got to see these dances, performed throughout the year, for many years, from a young girl till I moved out of Santa Clara when I was like 17. Dances are something that's performed throughout the year as a way to give thanks to the Creator, for the food that was provided from the animals that were hunted. I think, pottery has always been like a book. They didn't, the early Pueblo people, they didn't write their history on paper. They put it on the clay. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the early Anasazi, the Mimbres people, you can look at a vessel and that there were dragonflies with the Mimbres people because they painted them on their pots. So there was a story there. We learned about plants, this information, knowledge, medicinal herbs, mm-hmm. healing plants. That's what they paint. What you see on pottery was important, and it did have a message. It wasn't the words we're used to, but you see it in the design.
Mm-hmm. Rob, if you want to go to the next slide, please. I thought we would talk a little bit about your move into bronze, which you're doing simultaneously with ceramics. This is, of course, one of your more monumental pieces. It was in the Masters, and it is also now, thankfully, in the Autry collection. It's called Andrea, and it is I believe, somewhat taller than life-size figure of a dancer that is like all of your ceramics. It has this amazing sort of in the round quality. And if many sculptures and sculptors do that, but I think that there is a relationship between your work in bronze or your work in ceramics, and your ability to kind of translate this overall 360 sense of design into bronze, and why, just sort of generally, what was it about bronze that intrigued you? You're so successful in ceramics. Why take a risk like that, which has clearly paid off, but it was a risk nonetheless?
I think artistically, I was ready for a change. After I felt like I had worked in clay, I perfected certain forms. I was working in a scale that was so big, that I couldn't even lift myself. It was getting, I felt like I was ready for another outlet. And when I considered going into bronze, what attracted me was the durability of the metal, the strength that it offered, and the color, like I mentioned earlier. But, creatively, before I went into bronze, I spent about 2 years working in the water-based clay. I was no longer focused on symmetry, but asymmetrical forms. And I started creating more unusual and abstract forms in clay. And it was an incredible learning curve because I felt like I was learning how to create in a whole different way. I now had to see this abstract form and figure out, okay, where do I apply the coils, and balance the strength. And, it took a lot of broken vessels to get to that big piece, that's now in the Autry. But, those coiling a large vessel like that and having it collapse on me when it was only 3/4 of the way done, I learned that I was moving way too quick. But I don't know. I felt like I had pushed the water-based clay to, I was now in these asymmetrical forms and switching mediums, going to an oil-based clay. Now I had this material that didn't dry. And so I had the luxury of time. And hence these monumental pieces. My first bronze was about 12 inches. And my third one, I think, was about 6 feet. So I was just ready, I think storing designs for years. When it finally happened, I was ready. Bronze was exciting. Like I said, being able to use colors, that weren't so pastel and clay slips, more muted.
Well, it's interesting also the sense of movement that you are able to get because, traditional ceramic vessels are such a contained, self-contained, static form. And this piece, even though it's metal, really kind of moves. I mean, the skirt, even though it has sort of a lot of diagonals and hard lines in it, flows. And there's a lot more that we could talk about with this piece, but I do want to speaking of form and pure form, I do want to get to a couple other slides. Rob, if you could go to the next, please. Oh, there's Andrea in the galleries. Yep, during a new acquisition show that we had a few years ago, so everybody can get a sense of scale and what she looks like when she's lit. The color, especially under sort of the intense museum lighting in an otherwise relatively dark space, is just amazing. It's also something that Tammy's sculpture is really great to get up close to see the nuances in the patinas. They're really rich and subtle and they're just gorgeous. But next slide, please. Okay, so these are all really just sort of sculptural pieces for their own sake. They're non-figurative, very contemporary looking. They stand alone, independent of function or narrative, and yet they are very much connected to tradition. So can you explain a little bit about that? Because these look so incredibly modern on the one hand, yet on the other, I know that they have very traditional sources, both for their designs and their appearance.
So the piece that you have that's on the far right is element 2. And that particular sculpture, I was inspired by looking at one of my Grandma Christina's carved pots. And, you know, it was her mother, Serafina, who really began carving, and she taught her children. So, you know, Christina being a second generation carver now, it was on the simple side, just not very elaborate, you know, this simple form. And I remember looking at it and thinking that I want to bring this design to the forefront. I wanted to make it important. I wanted it to stand on its own. And not only did I cast it in bronze, but it was also cast in lead crystal.
Mm.
And
Wow.
so I think what's been exciting over the years is being able to work in different mediums. You know, not only bronze and the coil built pottery, but also glass. So, you know, once you
Which takes us actually to our next slide, our next set of slides, Rob, if you can move along. Yes, so I have a number of images of the glass slides. We're running a little low on time, so I'm going to try to speed us up just a little bit. This is, of course, an entry into one of the prize-winning pieces from the Masters. It is absolutely amazing, and I wanted to show an up close of the surface to speak about sort of the variety of color and the irregularities that are kind of built into glass itself as a medium, little air bubbles and specks that turn into different colors, I think, under heat. So why, now that you've mastered ceramic and bronze, what it is about glass that intrigued you? And how is it different, I guess, from those other two mediums? And what do you like about it? What makes it special as a sculpture?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I'll make it quick. This piece that we're looking at, this is a blown glass vessel. And a number of years ago, I was invited for a 5-day residency at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma. And for 5 days, I had a crew, and we blew these glass vessels that I was very much inspired by Pueblo pottery. You know, I love how each, you know, I still come back to Pueblo pottery being an incredible inspiration. I chose colors like the colors of clay. This piece right here is actually black glass, you know, inspired by the black pottery. It was reduced. There's a reduction process that happens at the very end where you increase the heat by throwing wax into the glory hole, into the kiln. And it increases the fire, and you get this iridescent glaze, which reminded me of gunmetal pottery, which is it's rare to achieve gunmetal. It is not an easy process, but through glass, you know, and this iridizing process.
So how then are these, you know, within glass, you can't, I mean, these have to be blown first and you can't draw on them as that is happening. How do you get the raised design in a glass piece?
So once the piece is blown, there's cold work that's done, and that's to like level it, get rid of any sharp edges. At that point, when I get the I cover the glass vessel in a rubber mylar, which acts as a stencil. And then I draw the design using a Sharpie. I put the design on, I draw it on the Mylar. And then with an X-Acto blade, the background is removed, the back Mylar. What's going to be blasted. And my assistant at the time, Sam Brock, he was doing, the process is called sandblasting. And so we sandblast into the glass to get a carved effect. with,
Mm-hmm.
being similar to Pueblo pottery, to the carved Pueblo pottery. That's what I wanted to achieve. Blasting at different levels, you can see various colors. On this piece also, I added glass frit, gold glass frit, and that's what the specks that you see are. I also used gold leaf. If you look at the top part of the vessel, so incorporated paper, gold paper over the hot glass, to give color, and you ask what attracts me to glass. It definitely was the color, having the color options. There is it was hard to I definitely went into this process with a goal, and having Pueblo pottery and the colors of, the black pottery and the polychrome pottery. It was those colors that I looked for in glass. And
well, speaking of color, if we can get Rob to the last couple of slides about the collaborative work, and then I do want to leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So you have now famously collaborated with Preston Singletary, known, of course, for his glass work, and Northwest Coast, sensibilities. These are just these, I can't even describe them. They're so beautiful. And I've seen them, when they're lit, the way that the glass glows and the way that it changes color depending upon the angle that you're looking at and the nature of the light and where it's coming from. So can you speak a little bit about why you wanted to do these collaborations? Preston is not the only artist that you've collaborated with now, and how that goes when two artists with such distinct, sort of sensibilities and aesthetics come together.
Yeah, it was such an honor to work with Preston Singletary. What he was doing in glass, his attention to detail. He was sandblasting in his glass sculptures, which were similar to, the clay pottery, which was what attracted me to him, and knowing Preston's work and knowing that he was a perfectionist, I went into this collaboration knowing that whatever I designed, he could do it. If he wasn't sure, he was willing to try. He used calipers. These vessels that you see are exact to my dimensions. The colors, again, of course, the black and white, like inspired by the Anasazi pottery, and this brown and cream color piece with the trout. It has a black glass lip, and it's a fluted lip at that. He's probably glad it's over. I think what's fun about working with various artists, and even the Bronze Foundry, I was told that the foundry had to come up with new techniques to achieve the forms I was working in, the colors, like you mentioned, the amount of patinas. There are some designs that will have up to like 5 layers of color. And again, with glass, I was able to just have fun. And, you learn quickly, some glass gets too hot and it won't adhere to other glass. And so it's a whole other chemical process that's happening, and it's happening fast. I was able to see, these vessels, maybe 15 inches, as big as as big as I could go. I was, I think pushing Preston to the limits, of what the glory hole could hold. And when you're working with an artist like Preston, who has that experience, it's so much fun, and if a piece didn't succeed, what we learned was tremendous, and the next piece that came out was even better.
Mm-hmm.
It's,
I'm sorry.
it's really cool to be at a point where, I've over the years had the experience to work in, have other experience, like working on these doors for Hotel Chaco, the glass oculus, designing jewelry and having Phil Poirier execute them in gold. I had the opportunity to paint a hotel in Albuquerque, Hotel Nativo Hotel, and work with house paint. I did a mural. I think, when we try new experiences, the learning experience is incredible.
Well, we have just a few minutes left. I want to go to the very last slide, speaking of the new, because these are some new pieces that I believe nobody has seen yet. If you want to talk just briefly about these, and then we'll have just a few minutes for a couple of questions.
So I think over the years, I've been incorporating other elements in the clay, such as texture, to bring another element of design, help separate the smooth. Working in glass, I was seeing designs as frosted and clear. Pottery, I see the smooth background and the textured background. I've also been inspired by jewelry. I love jewelry. The piece on the that I'm seeing on my far left with the dancer, you can see she's framed. She's got a frame around her. I love Charles Lolema jewelry. I created this stacked stone effect in clay, and when it's polished with the red slip, it looks like coral.
I can see that. I can see the texture to it.
I was incorporating stones for a while, and I thought, the clay is my jewel. And so I started seeing, creating these pieces that are more jewel-like, and creating the stones out of clay. The texture, it looks like a sand cast.
Now that you mentioned that, I really want to get up close and sort of see these pieces. There's something about the texture that makes these perhaps even more like haptic or touchable than some of the others. Those are just beautiful. Well, thank you so very much. I would like to leave just a few minutes now for questions because we have a few, and I'll just read them out. This is a really interesting one. It says, your description of clay sounds like special recipes. Do you keep a secret family recipe book handed down, or are the recipes only passed via memory from generation to generation? And I assume they're talking about clay and not food. Although if you have food too, by all means.
It's interesting. I can remember as a young girl when, that the eldest, my grandma Mary, when we would help her, this was going to be her clay. And when we would mix the clay and the volcanic ash, she would taste it. She would go by taste and she could say, yeah, there's enough in there.
Wow, that's
We
interesting.
would all, kind of look at each other and taste it too. I remember getting a taste of what it should taste like when the ratio is just right.
Wow.
We, it's, it's pretty much a 50-50 ratio of clay and ash. So it's really, but that can vary depending on how moist your clay is. When we process our clay, we dig it out of the hills and it's dry we dry it out and then we soak it in water and it gets strained through a very fine mesh screen, and over time the water separates from the clay. You're left with the clay at the bottom. And if you do your mix while it's too wet, it's not really 50-50. So you got to consider like moisture too, and the firmness of the clay. It's like it looks like chocolate pudding. I'll make my mark, and go by feel. So I'll measure out 50-50, but if it feels like it's got plenty at a certain before it's all mixed, I'll stop. So
do you still use the taste test at all in your work?
Yeah. You can feel the ash and taste it.
That is fascinating. I had no idea. So it is actually it's cooking in a way. It certainly involves a lot of heat and chemistry.
Yeah.
One other question. Let's see. This is another interesting question. I'm delighted to meet you. Thank you for being with us. Are you ever amazed by any piece you have created? So is there something when it's finished, you're just like, wow, I did that.
Yes, definitely. And looking at the finished work that Charles sent today, clay, it's quite a process. I don't make a lot of pieces, because they're handmade. And to see the body of work over a number of years and to be able to see how my work has evolved. I love what I do, when I think, something that I noticed about my grandma Mary is she was happy, and I know that it was the clay that made her happy.
It speaks to sort of the relationship, I think. And along those lines, I know that we're at time, but there is another really interesting question here that I want to put out there before you go. And that is to do with your relationship with music and rhythm while you were working. Is there a regularity to your work? Do you listen to music while you work? And if so, what genres? Or what else is in your mind while you're working?
Interesting you bring that up. My dad was a musician, and we grew up with rock and roll. Definitely. What's great about working at home and being self-employed is I can watch TV or I can listen to music. And when it comes time to designing, it can only be music. And it seems like I can, just focus on the creative part, the design and what I'm doing. Brothers Osborne, I've been listening to them lately. I'm not for everyone. My dad, he loved the Rolling Stones. Janis Joplin, I love listening to her music. Amy Winehouse. I could go on and on.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So it's rock and roll.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much. On that note, it's really been a pleasure to speak with you today. I appreciate your time, your willingness to do this. Thank you to everybody who took the time to hear and learn about Tammy's work this afternoon, and to learn more about the Masters of the American West and when you can purchase Tammy's work. Please visit the Autry, www.theautry.org, and join me again on February 17th for another Salon, Masters Salon with the artist Billy Schenk. Also, if you're hankering for more of these sooner than that, we have one next Wednesday with an amazing artist, Lakota painter and beater Diane Whitehawk, who will be speaking with our Vice President of Native Collections and Amundsen Curator of Native American History and Culture, Joe Horsecapture. So I hope you'll join us for that, as well as Billy Schenk. And please do go to the website to check out all of our great masters' work and Tammy's in particular. So thank you again, Tammy, so much for being part of the show, for being here with us this afternoon. It was just great. I so appreciate it. And thanks to everybody.
Yeah, thank you.